The siege of Beslan left a scar on both North Ossetia and Russia as a whole. 20 years on, we ask, what is the legacy of Beslan? This week, we spoke to Zalina Bogazova, a survivor of Beslan, about how those events have continued to shape the lives of her and hundreds of others. We also spoke to Ossetian political analyst Rooslán Totrov about Russia's handling of the attack and how the war against Ukraine has changed how Beslan is remembered. I'm Robin Fabro, and you're listening to the Caucasus Digest. "20 years ago, under orders from Chechen warlord Shamil Basayev, a group of Islamist militants took over 1,000 people, including nearly 800 children, hostage at a school in Beslan, an unassuming town in North Ossetia. The school was besieged by the authorities for 3 days, which culminated with Russian forces storming the school and a battle that led to the deaths of 334 people, among them 186 children. Many have suggested that the high death toll might have been avoided, leading to calls for an investigation to hold Russian officials accountable for mishandling the crisis. However, even Russian President Vladimir Putin appears to have forgotten about the investigation. In a rare visit to Beslan last week, his first since 2008 and his second overall visit to the tragedy-torn town, Putin met with representatives of the Mothers of Beslan, a movement founded with the aim of achieving an effective investigation into the siege. He expressed surprise when members of the organisation told him that the official investigation into the incident had still, 20 years on, not been completed. Zalina Bogazova was in the 11th grade when armed terrorists entered the school in Beslan. While Zalina narrowly escaped being taken captive, her mother and sister were less fortunate, perishing during the siege. Zalina, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to share your experiences.
Hello, Robin. Thank you for having me.
Zalina, first of all, could you walk us through what you remember of the first day of that siege?
Well, I have always, for last 10 years, maybe more, I just rely on my, checkpoints during these days. So the moment when I woke up and if someone can remember, before the September the 1st, there was quite a number of terrorist attacks in Russia. Plane was blown up. It was an explosion in Moscow near the metro station. As I remember, because right now I'm familiar that there is a Mandela syndrome, etc., etc. But I woke up and my first thing was that I hope there will be no terrorist attacks during this day at our school. And my second thought was that, of course, there will be no terrorist attack on our school because we're a small town. Nobody knows about us. It shouldn't be a case. Maybe something could happen, but not in such a small town. After that, I woke up. I went to school with my mother because my sister was already there with her friend, her classmate, who unfortunately also been killed during the attack with her mother and her little brother. I went with my mother. I asked her to go with me because it was my last grade. I was going to give a speech during the celebration of starting of the academic year. She took a video camera to make a record of this day for me. It was me who asked her. We went together and I didn't see my sister much. I met her briefly, and then I left her and her class and joined my class because I thought, I will catch up with her later. We were standing very close to it, but I think it could be considered close in a regular situation. But if we're speaking about terrorist attack and such conditions, she was miles away from me, because he didn't have a chance to escape. And my mother was with her at this moment, because the event, celebration event, didn't start yet. After that, I ran away. I started to run, but then I stopped, because I understood that not a lot of people comprehended what is going on right now, because you couldn't believe in it, and it takes time to process this. And I started to shout, please, let's run away. Don't stand here. And then I ran. The next couple of hours were just a mess. I ran to our home. We live in a building with 5 floors and 6 entrances. A lot of people live there. I lived near the school. And I started to explain to my neighbor what happened. She invited me into her apartment, and I've turned on TV and been waiting for the news. And I think the news came in, I don't know, maybe a couple of hours or maybe an hour. Journalists started to arrive to Beslan. There was a lot of journalists around our building. I knew one of them. I saw him and I gave them an interview. Short interview explaining what happened, how many people were there, etc., etc. Prior to this moment, my father came from war because he heard that something happened. People were panicked. They left jobs. They came to their homes. I explained him. He tried to stay calm. He left to any place where he could get any information. Then I left our home. I've been for 3 days with my mother's brother. It was the home when my mother was brought up. And unfortunately, my cousin, daughter of my uncle, also were hostages, but thankfully she's alive, and her mother also. I spent these 3 days there, but my father was in the center of Beslan, in the place where they could get any information about all these events. And after that, it was waiting for me, waiting and waiting, checking the news, thinking of how it would end. But, I was so sure that everything will be fine, even on the next day, on the second day, because as Hollywood taught us, everything always work out. But unfortunately, it wasn't the case regarding my family. I am very happy for people who survived and for their families. It's a miracle that a lot of people could survive this event, and I'm very happy for them. But for me, it not ended so well, and I live with this by this day.
And how has your family coped with this tragic loss?
Well, it wasn't easy. My family, since that, particularly me and my father, and if we're talking about our extended family, yes, there is a lot of members of this extended family in the community, like in Ossetia. For the next year, we were going through a lot of customs, traditions that take place after someone from your family has passed. Basically, every month, I think it was somehow any kind of such event, such gathering, services in their memory. It was a year of mourning, I would say. And not for only my family, but also for people of Beslan, people of North Ossetia and South Ossetia also, because we do not divide ourselves into political entities, because it's the only one Ossetia for us. Of course, it affected us. It affected my father's health, not only mental health, but physical health. And he struggles with Parkinson's disease. It accelerated such stress that he went on. I also had my mental issues, my PTSD. I think only 10, maybe 15 years later, I started to treat because I didn't know that there is such thing, and I was not so aware of help that I can get with mental health professionals. Despite that, many of them visited this Beslan, but I would say that there was some occasional help to the people of Beslan regarding their mental health, but there was no any systematic approach in this. Many people are not getting help they needed. Of course, they live with it, they manage, but I wish that there were more attention to this matter from government, basically.
And during those days of the siege, do you think the authorities, could they have done more to save lives?
Yes, of course, I think. There was room for negotiations. I think the government must negotiate to help people survive. I do not share an approach that there is no room for negotiations with terrorists. If these negotiations could save a life, these negotiations should take place. By all means, as much people as possible should be rescued.
And last week, we saw President Putin. He paid a visit to Beslan. Now, he was also in charge at that time. I mean, how did his visit make you feel? How did you feel about that?
I view it as a PR stunt because he needs to draw attention away from the situation in the country regarding this current events, regarding the current war. I just consider it as a PR stunt.
And in the years since this tragedy occurred, how do you feel that you and other survivors, the families of victims, have been treated by the authorities? You mentioned before some of the support you received, but do you think that was enough?
The authorities of the North Ossetia didn't handle such situations before. They didn't have any experience in that, so they didn't have any systematic approach. But I have 2 points. One point is people from all over the world helping us, inviting us to retreats, to visit cities and other countries, European countries, Canada, CIS countries, many countries. Many people wrote us letters, and it was a huge support. They sent us donations. So we felt we are loved by, I would say, international community. The second point is regarding authorities, and I would divide this part in two because there is authorities of North Ossetia and Russian authorities. I would say that North Ossetian authorities were much more responsive for the needs of people. Despite that, elections were dismantled by Putin after the events and using it as an excuse, our tragedy as an excuse to not hold elections in Russian regions. Since we're a small community, small republic, people knew each other, and I would say that Ossetian authorities were much more responsive. But on the federal scale, national scale, I would not say so, because maybe there was room for empathy, but I think that federal national authorities didn't want to do anything more than some stuff that could just calm down the people in Ossetia to avoid any protests, etc., etc. So I think basically they just did the minimum thing that they could.
It's been 20 years now since those events, and I wonder, do you feel that any kind of justice has been done for you and other survivors?
No, I don't feel at all like this. I don't feel it because, as Mr. Putin discovered last week, the investigation is not yet finished. I think there is no many desire to finish it and to conduct it proper way. Mainly people who we call Siloviki, who were responsible for safety of our citizens, people who should done their work better. And I mean these people not from only Ossetia, because we could say that high-ranking people from national agencies, FSB, internal affairs, etc., they didn't do their work proper. This is why this attack happened. No one took responsibility for this. No one resigned. Everyone kept their places, kept their titles. In Ossetia, some people stepped down, but only some. Even the president at the time, Alexander Sokhov, he didn't resign immediately because people demanded it, but he didn't resign. And as far as I can understand, it intended policy of the Moscow do not meet demands of the people. They think that they will show themselves as weak. So as far as I know, the Sokhov was ready to resign, but he wasn't allowed to do so. I don't know in details, but I heard something like this. Yes, and since no one held responsible for this, I don't think that there's any closure for me, for example.
Zalina Bogazova, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you.
Rooslán Totrov is a political analyst and journalist from North Ossetia. He joins us now. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Robin. My pleasure.
So, Rooslán, can we start at the beginning? Why was Beslan, of all places, targeted?
Look, I wouldn't really want to speculate too much about it. And, picturing Beslan as some sacred place among all other spots in the North Caucasus area. But if you look at it, if you look at the prehistory of what happened, if you looked at the political, or rather geopolitical extravaganza in the region in the previous 20 years, you'd see that there was a war conflict between Ossetia and Ingushetia. There were two wars in Chechnya. So everything has been happening in this rather highly dense, very small area in the big Caucasus. Ossetia being the only Christian, or predominantly Christian republic among other Muslim states, has always, unfortunately, been a target of terror attacks. I've been doing quite a few pieces on this, and I've counted more than 20 instances of terror attacks in North Ossetia prior to the school siege in Beslan. So unfortunately, our people were, and it's very unfortunate, somewhat used to this, and that's a terrible thing to say. But yeah, so Beslan, it was not something we expected, but it was something that could well have happened, and it did, unfortunately.
And many of the survivors of this tragedy have suggested that the authorities, the Russian authorities that is, could have and should have done more to save lives. What do you make of that claim?
I would first of all say, Robin, that this claim is probably an understatement. I would want to refer you to the resolution of the European Court, which clearly states that Russian authorities were probably running a terrorist annihilation mission, but not necessarily the proper rescue of hostages. The European Court very clearly states in its resolution that the Russian authorities use what's labeled as indiscriminative weapons, including fire throwers, including tanks. And these weapons were used whilst the vast majority of hostages was still inside the building. So to answer your question, absolutely yes. When I was doing my own pieces over the years on the investigation and on this, on not just on the siege itself, but much rather on the 3rd of September, on the grand finale of the siege, it was absolutely obvious that again the Russian government was after the terrorists, and rescue mission was somewhat not a priority, to say the least.
And do you think this was different to, for example, how the authorities handled the Moscow theater hostage crisis? Do you think there was perhaps a kind of an ethnic component in that the victims, the hostages, were from the Caucasus and not from Moscow?
You are referring to the infamous 2002 siege of North Ost. Look, I would really want to remind you, Robin, that the Russian authorities used some gas, to what they labeled as putting terrorists asleep back at North Ost, but this very gas was the cause of death of many civilian hostages there. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the regime was more humane or less humane in either of the instances. Look, the only difference between the theater siege and in Moscow and the school siege in North Ossetia was that it would be much more difficult, for example, for the authorities to conceal the exact number of hostages. You remember very well that the narrative from the official Russian media pundits and the government officials that there were 354 hostages in the school, whilst everybody in Ossetia knew straight away that we were talking as little as 1,200 hostages. So our very traditional society and very strong horizontal ties that we have in this society wouldn't necessarily allow concealing this information. So it was an ethnic difference, but just contextually, if you will, not necessarily in the way the Russian authorities treated the hostage situation, so to speak. I mean, a lot of similarities. Come on, a lot of similarities in killing terrorists first and then rescuing whoever we can second, not vice versa.
And following the incident, how did the investigation unfold?
They've immediately formed a so-called parliamentary committee that was led by Senator Torshin. This committee, as you can well imagine, obviously didn't provide any concrete answer on the indiscriminate weapons, any concrete answer on why the storming of the building has started in the first place, what caused the initial explosion inside the school. So this is why the inability of Torshin's committee to answer the most crucial questions led to a very quick creation of the second alternative committee led by Senator Savelyev and heavily supported by independent journalists and public figures in Ossetia. Savelyev's committee really concentrated on answering those very questions I've already mentioned. And it was Savelyev's committee that came up with dreadfully convicting for the Russian regime conclusions about the indiscriminate weapons, about fire throwers, about tanks, about a very controversial nature of that explosion inside the school. So if Robin, you compare the two reports, the governmental or official committee report and the alternative one, they are poles apart in terms of the conclusions, and you can well guess which report favors which point of view. And look, it's been 20 years now. And a few days ago, when President Putin finally decided to stop by Beslan on his way to Chechnya, he did meet with mothers of Beslan, with the members of the organization, and he acted like he didn't know anything about the investigation. And this is this piece of information is not classified. I mean, this is what mothers of Beslan shared with the media and with the public, that Putin was, and I quote, acting surprised when he heard that it's been 20 years and an investigation came to nowhere.
I want to ask you a bit more about that visit by Putin. How do you think that was received in North Ossetia?
That's a very interesting question, because the overall war hysteria that started in Russia and in North Ossetia, indeed being an integral part of Russia, the war hysteria. This is how I label what goes on in the past, what's been going on in the past couple of years. It really shifted the paradigm a bit. If you asked me this question 5 years ago, I'd tell you that Ossetians would be greeting the president and commenting on his visit in a much colder fashion. But the war hysteria, unfortunately, shifted the paradigm and shuffled the cards, if you will. I've been hearing and I've been witnessing quite a lot of praise for Vladimir Putin finally showing up in the school. Obviously, it's not a unified point of view, but I just wanted to really reiterate that the Ossetian society is currently extremely shell-shocked, Robin, and the Ukrainian war is the main reason. You have thousands and thousands of Ossetians fighting there, and you have a Russian state, which North Ossetia is, that's probably, obviously there is no statistics, but probably one of the most war-supporting states of them all, which obviously in turn changes the perception of Putin's role in the drama of Beslan. So no, he is not the one receiving marching orders, pardon the football terminology, not at all. Generally, the public says that, hey, yeah, it's been a long time, and he could have probably visited the school earlier, but look, the president kneeled down, and the president paid the utmost respect. And that's a very pitiful and a very sad school of thought that I'm dealing with here, and this is something that's been really troubling me personally as an Ossetian and professionally as a political journalist for the past few days.
And during this visit, Putin, he suggested that the terrorists at Beslan were supported by foreign actors. So, I mean, this framing, it's kind of along anti-Western lines, I think. Do North Ossetians buy into that narrative that the Russian government is presenting?
On the one hand, Robin, this is not a new narrative by all means. Let me remind you that literally on 4th of September 2004, the Russian officials were claiming that there were Arabs, Africans, and God knows who else among the terrorists. The Saudi narrative was there as well. Few terrorists back then have been claimed to have close ties with Saudi Arabia. And then for 20 years, there's always been a consensus. Come on, the vast majority of terrorists have been identified. The vast majority of terrorists came from the neighboring Republic of Ingushetia. So the vast majority of terrorists were Ingush people by descent. And it's never, ever been supposed even by the officials that they had any links or ties to the collective West, if you will. The infamous Shamil Basayev and his crew have always been labeled, and I mean that's also there's also a consensus on that they are the ones responsible for planning and carrying this out. Case closed in a way. No, the war hysteria that I mentioned to you a few minutes ago led to President Putin now obviously playing this card. And I very much expected him to do so, Robin. Yes, when he says that there were foreign actors involved in planning and executing the siege of the school in Beslan, you understand, I understand, and we all understand. He's really trying to link the West to it. He could give a damn about Saudi Arabia or any other country here in the region. No, it is his intention, and it's very, very explicit, to say, you know what, people of Russia, the West, the much demonized West, had a part to play in the bloodiest act of terror in the history of Russia. Obviously, he would love to also include Ukraine in the equation, but that would be so absurd that even the utmost Putinists would not necessarily buy that narrative. So he says foreign actors obviously pointing finger at the West.
You mentioned there that the attackers were mostly English. And I wonder how has the attack affected this relationship between North Ossetians and English?
Let me take you back to 1992, when we in North Ossetia were invaded by gangs from Ingushetia. It was a 3-4 day standoff, if you will, that was ended by the involvement of Russian military back then. So no, there was no love lost in that relationship between us and the English people by 2004 indeed. And again, I just want to be very, very clear here. I'm talking to you as a political journalist, not just as an Ossetian citizen, right? So when I claim that the vast majority of the gang that took the school hostage were English people, that's just pure facts. The list of identified terrorists is widely available in the media, online, etc. So there's nothing personal in what I'm saying here. I'm just stating the facts. So look, there was no love lost in this relationship between Ossetians and the English folks, and obviously the bloodiest act of terror in the history of my people contributed to those relations to even worsen. We were never on any brink of another war conflict, if that's what you want to ask, Robin. But like I said, it's a relationship where the smallest spark can really ignite some very terrifying processes, if you will. I'm not trying to be an alarmist here, but I'm just rather trying to evaluate what goes on geopolitically in the most sober fashion. Now, finally, the war that Russia started two and a half years ago contributed to any internal geopolitical issues inside Russia to really be, let me put it this way, fading away, because as of right now, Ossetians, just as many other nations, smaller nations in Russia, they clearly know, and this is me being very sarcastic, but at the same time very sad. They clearly know that their ultimate enemy is Ukraine and Ukrainian people. So any beef, so to speak, with the English folks or with whoever is not as relevant to your nuclear Ossetian population at the moment as what goes on in the Ukraine. And I'm not joking. This is a pitiful reality.
Finally, I want to ask you about the legacy of this tragedy, and how do you think it's changed Ossetian society?
Robin, we have been shell-shocked for 20 years. PTSD, the collective PTSD is there. Even those who do not necessarily talk about the tragedy openly, who think they were not affected by the tragedy, but they were. We are a tiny society. Come on, you're looking at a nation probably 600,000-700,000 people strong globally. More than a half of those living in Ossetia. So we are a tiny nation. And when we say we know each other, this is not a figure of speech. We know each other, which means there's not a single family in Ossetia that's been either directly or indirectly affected by the siege and by the consequences of the siege. So it's a shell-shocked society. It's a rather disorientated society in political and in civil terms, if you will. And I believe that instead of engaging itself in some form of collective treatment, collective reflection on what happened and why it happened, our society, our people, they've continued venturing into things that have nothing to do either with Ossetian national idea or with Ossetia itself. The Ukrainian war is your amazing example. The Donbass events of 2014 is your great example where Ossetians were involved, and so on and so forth. Concluding this answer to your question, Robin, I want to say that Ossetian people have been victims of Soviet and then Russian political regimes for more than 100 years. Victims in a sense that any form of national idea, be it political or socio-economic idea, has been wiped out of the collective memory of generations and generations of Ossetians, and very successfully substituted with first Soviet and then Russian ideas. Your average Ossetian person today thinks in Russian, but not Ossetian terms, first and foremost. That's the answer to your question.
Rooslán Totrov, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Robin.
That's it for this week's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to support our work, please consider becoming an OC Media member. Membership includes a host of benefits, including newsletters, audio versions of articles, and more. Sign up at oc-media.org/membership. This week's show was presented by me, Robin Fabro. Producing and editing was by Yusuf Bartoka. The theme music was by Ben Wheeler.